Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Pan Am that happen after the cameras turn away. The systems behind the games, the contracts hidden inside victory, the lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the Capital relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Pan Am always wants you to stop paying attention. Picture the 75th arena. A perfect circle of jungle and water, hiding a giant clock. Every wedge, a different kind of death on a schedule. Or think about the 74th Games, that metal plate you're standing on, rising out of the ground toward the cornucopia. The countdown, the force field, the buried mines. How long does something like that actually take to build, wire, and test? We're told it all appears for 1 year, one set of tributes, then it's over. At face value, the games feel annual, almost disposable. New arena, new mutts, new story. But here's the real question. Could the Capital really design an entire artificial ecosystem? Install hidden speakers, cameras, force fields, climate controls, and mutt pods in a few months? Or are you walking into a machine that's been waiting for you since before you were born? The 74th Hunger Games was probably planned before Katniss could walk. Not the exact tributes, but the stage, the tech, the script beats. We know arenas become permanent tourist attractions, which means they're built as long-term facilities, not temporary sets. That part matters, because a permanent arena needs foundations, power grids, maintenance tunnels, staff training. You don't pour that much concrete and code just to improvise, so the real timeline starts to shift. While District 12 is still losing unnamed children in earlier games, engineers in the Capital are already laying out the lake, where Katniss will meet Rue's mockingjays. While Prim is a toddler, mutt designers are figuring out how to embed tribute DNA into those wolf-like creatures that appear at the end. There is a lot to uncover here once you stop seeing the games as a yearly event and start seeing them as a rolling, decades-long logistics project. And that raises a bigger question. If the Capital can engineer climates on command, if they can spin a jungle into poisonous fog at the flick of a switch, why pretend the reaping is random and the arena is fresh chaos every year? Why sell the promise of unpredictability when the infrastructure is literally bolted to the ground years in advance? Why insist that anything can happen when almost everything has already been scheduled? This is where we talk about the state-level machine behind the spectacle, the relationship between Gamemakers, Mutt R&D labs, and the peacekeepers who secure these sites before a single tribute arrives. We're going to cover how secret tribute files are built over years of surveillance, why mutts are the final product of long experiments, and what backup plans exist if a Katniss-level rebellion walks into an arena that was never meant to lose control. Because by the time Effie draws a name in any district, the arena isn't being chosen. It's already been waiting. Why the logistics of the games decide who lives, who rebels, and who watches. Because by the time Effie draws a name in any district, the arena isn't being chosen. It's being activated. Back in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the early games are basically a war crime in a crumbling stadium. No roof, no climate control. Tributes shoved in a zoo cage because no one's bothered to build anything else. At face value, that's already horrifying. So why does the Capital move from that crude punishment to the hyper-engineered theme parks we see in Katniss's era? Why spend years building permanent arenas with underground control rooms? Why turn them into tourist attractions afterward? Why keep mutation labs and force field tech running year-round instead of just dusting them off once a year? Here's the real question. What kind of government invests more in a murder ecosystem than in its own district's food supply? The reason is that the logistics decide everything. In the early years, the games are a message. You lost the war. Now, they're a whole political economy. When an arena can generate firestorms on command, or spin the ground in a clock pattern, it stops being a one-time punishment and becomes a reusable asset. There is a lot to uncover here, because that part matters for who lives, who rebels, and who keeps watching. Think about victors. You're told the goal is to survive. Become a victor, go home. But victory isn't the end of the games. It's the on-ramp into the pipeline. Mentoring? That's yearly labor for the system. Propaganda tours? That's traveling advertising, proving the capital's promise that anyone can win. Even their trauma is scheduled content. The capital doesn't retire its champions, it syndicates them. This is where we talk about infrastructure. Those high-speed trains. They don't just move coal and lumber. They guarantee tributes arrive on time, in perfect condition every year. Peacekeeper barracks aren't randomly placed. They sit where they can lock down reaping squares and escort kids to the station without delay. Even the Justice Building in each district doubles as a set, pre-lit for the emotional goodbye scene the cameras are waiting for. So why does every district's layout quietly bend around the games? Because the games are the beating heart that justifies everything else. Capital luxury needs a reason. District starvation needs a reason. The surveillance state that tracks children from the moment they take tesserae needs a reason. The annual arena is that reason, the ritual that explains why one city feasts while 12 districts bleed. And once you see the games as an engine instead of an event, another question appears. If the whole country is wired to serve this machine, what happens when the machine starts to fail? We're going to cover how that failure begins long before a rebellion reaches the arena, in the data, in the tech, and in the stories the capital thinks it's still controlling. Our angle. The Hunger Games as a 10-year project, not a 10-day event. So when does a Hunger Games really start? Not at the reaping, not even at the train. By the time Effie Trinket pulls a name, that year's games are already the end of a story the capital has been writing for close to a decade. The arena's been surveyed, hollowed out, wired. Mutts have been prototyped in labs, and somewhere in a quiet office, there's a file on almost every kid in your district who might end up on that stage. At face value, the games look chaotic. 24 teenagers thrown into a deadly wilderness, cameras scrambling to catch every scream, commentators reacting in real time. But here's the real question. How do you get an entire country to believe in chaos using one of the most organized systems Panem has ever built? This is where we talk about the games as a 10-year project, not a 10-day bloodbath. Think about arenas first. We know they're permanent, high-tech facilities that become tourist attractions later, which means the 74th arena wasn't whipped up because Katniss volunteered. It was probably on a rotation, maybe even meant for an earlier year, with buried infrastructure for firestorms, tracker-jacker releases, and that force field you only notice when someone hits it and dies. Then there's the tribute pipeline. Careers don't appear out of nowhere. They're the visible tip of a surveillance system that's been watching children since they could hold a training sword. Who's fast? Who's charismatic? Who cries when their sibling is punished? The capital has reasons to track all of that, because it turns the reaping into casting. Every tribute steps into the arena with a secret profile thicker than a capital fashion magazine. And that part matters because it lets game makers predict which pairings will spark, which rivalries will trend, and which deaths will sell the most sponsor gifts. So when we say we're going to cover the games as prestige TV, we mean it. Imagine multi-season arcs on a whiteboard in the Gamemakers' war room. One arena in active use, one in late-stage testing, one still in concept. Mutts in R&D for years before they ever crawl out of the ground. Tribute narratives planned the way a showrunner plans character arcs: tragic underdog, ruthless career, surprise romantic lead, then nudged into place with stylists, interview questions, and carefully chosen camera angles. The promise that capital sells is unpredictability. Anyone can win. Anything can happen. But there is a lot to uncover here, because behind that promise is a bureaucracy that schedules disasters, prints mutt DNA orders, and files contingency plans for arena failure or open rebellion. And that's our lens for the rest of this video, a logistics deep dive. We're not just talking themes, we're talking trains that must arrive to the minute, cameras that have to blanket a wilderness, and mutts that need to be grown, tested, and shipped without any district ever seeing the crates. So how do those timelines stack? How early do they start building your death trap? And what backup switches exist in case a girl from District 12 turns their 10-year project into a revolution on live TV? Your map through the arena. How we'll break down capital logistics, so to untangle all of that, you need a map. Because the games aren't just a brutal event, they're a multi-year logistics project, and there is a lot to uncover here. First, we're going to cover the long-term arena design. This is where we talk about the 10-year projects, the arenas that are prototyped, tested, then quietly mothballed until the capital decides the political moment is right. We'll zoom in on the 75th Quarter Quell Clock Arena and treat it the way an engineer would. 12 disaster zones, a rotating mechanism, buried wiring for force fields, and timed lightning, and a control system that has to survive storms, tributes, and BT trying very hard to fry it from the inside. Then we shift from landscapes to people. How early do you actually enter the tribute pipeline? At face value, it starts at your first reaping. But here's the real question. What if the capital has been building a profile on you since you were old enough to hold a training sword in District 2, or old enough to take Tesserae in District 12? We'll walk through a hypothetical life of a District 2 career under surveillance, the voluntary training gym, the quiet visits from peacekeepers, the evaluation files that follow them from childhood all the way to the launch room. From there, we get into the supply chains. This is where we talk about mutts, drones, sponsor parachutes, and force fields as products on a conveyor belt. Why does a wolf mutt show up with a dead tribute's eyes? That part matters because it implies DNA storage, psychological notes, and a warehouse where horror is literally assembled to order. We'll trace the journey of a single sponsor gift, from factory floor to hovercraft, to that one silver parachute that drops exactly when the cameras need a burst of hope. Next, we zoom out to the media layer. The capital doesn't just film the games, it scripts them. We're going to cover how pre-written storylines, interview prompts, and commentary beats turn tributes into archetypes. Then we'll pause for a meta segment, book versus movie. What does the novel's focus on control rooms, mutt design, and Claudius Temple-Smith's commentary tell us that the film's smooth over? And what do those adaptation choices quietly imply about how the system really works behind the scenes? After that, security, backup force fields, dead man switches for the arena, 3 different ways to kill the feed if a rebellion breaks out on live TV. Why did the 75th arena fail anyway? And finally, we'll end with speculative world building, how each district's infrastructure plugs into the games machine, and how close Panem comes to losing control. There's one logistical weak point that almost guarantees the capital's downfall once someone exploits it. We're not naming it yet. Welcome to the control room, channel context, and why this deep dive exists. So before we walk into that weak point and pull the wiring out, we need to talk about where we're standing. Because in a way, this whole channel is our own private control room for the Hunger Games. If you're new here, this is where we talk about the machinery behind the spectacle. Not who's hotter, Peter or Finnick, but why the capital invests in a permanent arena with buried climate controls, or how a single victor can change an entire district's food rations. At face value, The games are about kids in an arena. The real question is, what invisible systems have to exist so that arena can turn on every single year without failing? We're going to cover those systems piece by piece across the channel. The Victor's Village video was about housing as a weapon. The Reaping Breakdown digs into tesserae, probability, and how you quietly steer which children end up on the stage. Peacekeeper Deployment, that's an episode on troop rotations, supply lines, and why some districts feel occupied while others feel protected. And then there's the Propaganda series, where we map out how Caesar Flickerman, the stylists, and those interview packages are basically a state-run streaming service. This video sits right in the middle of that bigger project. There is a lot to uncover here, because long-term games planning touches every one of those systems at once. Arena design, tribute data files, mutation research, sponsor logistics, backup feeds if a rebellion hits the cameras. None of that happens in isolation. It's one relationship web, and the capital is at the center pulling on every thread. If you've been watching for a while, you already know the promise. We keep this fast and story-driven, even when we're talking about spreadsheets in the head Gamemakers office. So yes, we're going into supply chains, but we're doing it through concrete moments you recognize. Why the 74th arena could flood on command. Why the 75th's clockwork disasters reveal decades of testing. Why every mutt that appears on screen hints at a whole R&D department hidden under the city. And if you're the kind of person who pauses the movie to ask, wait, when did they build all those force fields? This is your place. We do lore deep, text-backed analysis with a bit of speculative flair, always grounded in what the books and films actually show us. If you want to be part of a sort of Victor's Village, for people who overthink Panem instead of retiring from it, you're invited to move in. So here's the real question before we head back into the narrative. What does the capital's planning office look like if you walk through it decade by decade? First, you pass the old arenas, mothballed and turned into tourist traps. Then you hit the tribute surveillance wing, where every potential victor already has a file. And at the very end of the hall, there's that weak point we mentioned, waiting for someone to notice. That's where we're going next. From ruins to reality TV, how the first arenas forced long-term planning, so when you walk past those mothballed arenas at the end of that capital hallway, here's the real question. How did a ruined stadium full of rubble turn into a climate-controlled murder terrarium with a gift shop attached? Back then, right after the dark days, the first 10 Hunger Games were barely arenas at all. They were repurposed ruins, bombed-out sports fields, half-collapsed factories. You throw in some weapons, some starving kids from each district, stick a few cameras on tripods and call it justice. At face value, that sounds efficient. No construction, no long-term cost, just pure punishment. But that part matters because punishment was never enough. Those early games were chaotic in the wrong way. Tributes disappeared into debris where cameras couldn't follow. Weather ruined broadcasts. Whole sections of the audience in the capital lost the feed when power failed. Sometimes a victor crawled out due to sheer accident, not narrative. There is a lot to uncover here about why that terrified Snow more than open rebellion. If the games are your central tool of control, you can't have the outcome decided by a misfiring generator. You need predictability. You need a clean story. And from a purely logistical angle, those improvised arenas were a nightmare. Every year meant new wiring, new security perimeters, new ways for desperate people to sneak in or out. The relationship between fear and spectacle was unstable. So the capital starts asking a different question. What if the arena isn't an event space, but a piece of national infrastructure? This is where we talk about force fields sunk deep into bedrock, permanent climate systems that can whip up a firestorm on command, and hidden weapon platforms that can be reprogrammed from year to year. You're not just building a killing field, you're building a reusable machine. Once they make that shift, everything else follows. You can't pour billions of capital credits into a single games and then bulldoze it. So the old arenas become tourist destinations, school trip material. You and your classmates from the capital can stroll through the bloodstains of the second games, watch a hologram replay of the final kill, and buy a replica spear on your way out. That tourist phase means maintenance crews, tech teams, gardeners, even hospitality staff cycling through the arena years before the next tribute ever sets foot there. And here's the real question again. If technicians are constantly inspecting force fields and mutt pens for tourists, do you really think the game makers only start planning the next games a few months in advance? Once the arena is permanent, the timeline stretches. You need multi-year design cycles, hazard testing, backup generators, evacuation plans if a mutt gets loose on a school tour. No more last-minute improvisation. Even the spontaneous disasters are pre-tested. By the time we reach Katniss's era, every arena you see on screen has already lived a whole secret life before the cameras roll. And in the next section, we're going to cover what fills that time. The tribute files, the mutt labs, and the quiet paperwork that decides who lives long enough to die on television. Snow's lesson. From the 10th game's disaster to a professional death machine. And this is where we talk about the one person who learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Coriolanus. Snow. Back in the 10th Hunger Games, you're not looking at a sleek death show. You're looking at a barely functioning hostage situation in a ruined zoo. No force fields, no climate controls, tributes shoved in animal cages, the Capitol bombing its own arena, and a broadcast that's so boring they literally have to add mentors and betting on the fly just to keep anyone watching. The games almost fail at their core job, selling power. At face value, you could say Snow just learned to be cruel there. He helps dream up spectacle. He leans into suffering. He sees that pain equals ratings. But here's the real question. What did he learn about control? Because from his perspective, the real disaster of the 10th games isn't the body count. It's how close the Capitol comes to looking weak, disorganized, and frankly amateur. The arena explodes. The tributes escape. The cameras lose the story. That part matters because Snow sees the nightmare scenario. If the audience ever realizes the Capitol can't even run its own punishment ritual, the entire threat to each district starts to wobble. Suddenly, the relationship between fear and obedience isn't guaranteed. So when that ambitious student eventually becomes President Snow, what's his response? He doesn't just make the games meaner. He makes them professional. We're going to cover the paperwork and pipelines in the next section, but the reason they exist at all starts here, in a zoo where nothing worked on purpose. You can almost map his presidency onto a corporate rebrand. Formal game maker departments instead of one desperate head game maker pulling all-nighters. R&D labs quietly prototyping mutts years in advance. Multi-year arena projects where engineers lay buried wires, water systems and force fields long before any tribute is reaped. The games stop being a yearly scramble and turn into a standing institution. And because Snow is obsessed with image, he doesn't just want a working show. He wants redundancies. You don't build one arena. You have multiple in development. So if a fault shows up, you postpone a design to a later year. You don't design one mutation. You keep backup swarms in cold storage, ready to drop in if the narrative stalls. Quarter-quell cards, those feel suspiciously pre-written, sitting in a vault so Snow can pull the one that fits the political moment. So why does this matter for Katniss's era? Because by then, the games aren't a broadcast you turn on once a year. They're a rolling, decade-long infrastructure project. Arenas maintained as tourist sites. Tech teams constantly upgrading control rooms. Surveillance on potential tributes from childhood. Feeding into those secret files we mentioned. The cameras stop, but the system never sleeps. And if Snow has turned the games into a permanent machine, the next question is obvious. What exactly is that machine doing in the off-season? In the next section, we're going to cover how that quiet time decides who lives, who dies, and who the capital pretends to offer hope to. Designing a death world. How long it takes to build a single arena, so when the cameras cut and the anthem fades, what is that machine actually doing? It's building a death world. This is where we talk about the arena itself as a long-term project, not a seasonal set. At face value, the 75th Quarter Quell Clock Arena looks spontaneous, chaotic, almost improvised, spinning jungle, random horrors, game makers pulling levers. But here's the real question. How far in advance do you have to plan something that precise before a single tribute steps out of the tube? Take one wedge of that clock, the lightning tree. Every 12 hours, on the second, it's hit with a perfectly timed strike. That means buried conductors, power routing, surge dampeners so the rest of the arena doesn't fry, and fail-safes so it never misfires on live television. Another wedge has the blood rain. That's not magic. That's storage tanks, pumps, filtration systems so it doesn't clot in the pipes, and drainage underneath the jungle floor. Then you've got jabberjays, which are basically flying surveillance devices with psychological warfare built in. They need breeding facilities, sound recording tech, release hatches, tracking. Each wedge is its own engineering project. Then the real nightmare is synchronization. 12 disasters, each on a strict schedule, all tied to a central control system that also runs the force field, the climate, and the cameras. You don't throw that together the year before a quell. You're looking at concept art, prototypes, lab tests, and small-scale arenas where they probably run animals or mutts through the cycle years in advance. Underground, it's even more intense. The force field generators that Peter slams into, those have to wrap the entire arena in a seamless shell, tuned so Phoenix Trident can blow a hole in one specific spot when BT redirects the lightning. Climate control has to fake a jungle while keeping all that hardware from overheating. Mutt release tunnels snake under the ground so beasts can appear from nowhere, on cue, without ever crossing a camera line early. There is a lot to uncover here, because the arena doesn't retire when the games end. It becomes a tourist destination. That part matters because it means redundancy and maintenance are baked in from day one. Generators with backups, hidden repair corridors, tech crews who stay on site for decades, quietly swapping out parts so Capital school kids can visit the famous lightning tree on field trips. So what's the rough timeline? You start with a political pitch, a clock-themed quell that promises control, inevitability, the sense that the tribute's fates are literally scheduled. Years of design work follow, then multi-year construction, then animal testing, system simulations, and endless safety checks, not for the tributes, for the broadcast. Finally, the political sign-off, which year gets which arena, which message, which district needs reminding. And here's the real question. If they're planning the environment a decade out, what does that say about how early they're planning the tribute's stories that have to fit inside it? Pattern break. What if the arena you see wasn't meant for that year? So here's the twist you're not supposed to think about. What if the arena you see in a given year wasn't actually built for that year at all? At face value, the Capital sells you this story that each games is handcrafted, bespoke, a one-of-a-kind nightmare tailored perfectly to that specific reaping. But here's the real question. With permanent arenas, buried tech, and decade-long construction, do we really think they're building these things one at a time on a 12-month deadline? Or is there a quiet warehouse of finished killing fields just waiting for the right political moment? There is a lot to uncover here. The infrastructure we just talked about doesn't pause. That means multiple arenas are probably sitting in various stages of readiness every year. One fully operational, one in testing, one still being wired for mutts and force fields. So if Snow wakes up and decides the mood in the districts is too hopeful, what's easier, redesign an entire environment, or simply swap in a harsher arena from the shelf and move the schedule around. Now take the 74th games. Dense forest, controlled fire, those wolf mutts with the tribute's eyes. What if that environment wasn't originally meant for Katniss's year? Imagine it's slotted for, say, the 72nd, a test run of psychological horror mutts before the quarter quell. Or, on the other side, imagine it was designed for a later, darker games, then pulled forward because the capital wanted a narrative of uncontrollable girl from a starving district thrown into a classic brutal arena. The arena tone has to match the story they want to tell about the rebellion risk that year. This is where we talk about quarter quells, because that part matters because of planning. Every 25 years, the capital promises a special twist. The second quell doubled the tributes. The third reached into the victor pool. You don't improvise an arena clock with timed poison fog, blood rain, and jabberjays overnight. So what if some of the most complex arenas are built early, then deliberately held back, waiting for a quell whose theme fits their particular brand of cruelty? But once you start shifting arenas around, the bureaucracy quietly explodes. Suddenly, propaganda posters don't match. You printed waves and tridents, and now you've decided to run the forest arena? Mutts have to be retooled. The engineering team that spent years perfecting aquatic lizards gets told, actually, we need wolf hybrids with recognizable district features. Sponsor messaging has to pivot from luxury cruise of death to back to nature survival epic without breaking the illusion that this was always the plan. And here's the pattern interrupt. If the environment is flexible, the tribute's narratives have to be even more flexible. How do you keep every victor's story on brand when the stage can change at the last minute? You don't just prepare costumes and interview questions. You build tribute files from childhood with multiple possible arcs, lover, martyr, underdog, monster, that can be slotted into whichever arena the capital pulls off the shelf next. So the real logistics problem isn't just where to put the trees or the tidal wave. It's how early you start shaping human beings so their stories can survive any swap. And that's the part we're going to cover next. Every child has a file. The tribute pipeline starts in kindergarten. If you want a story to survive any swap, you can't start at the reaping bowl. You start in the classroom. At face value, Panem's surveillance looks pretty simple. Peacekeepers on the streets. Tesserae records. Annual reaping list starting at age 12. But here's the real question. If the capital is organized enough to track every extra grain a starving family takes, do we really think they only start paying attention when your name goes into a glass ball? There is a lot to uncover here, because every one of those basic records is the public-facing part of a much deeper system. You sign up for Tesserae. That's not just a tally mark. That tells the capital your family's desperation level, your risk tolerance, your relationship to hunger and to hope, disciplinary slip at school. Now they know how you react to authority, get reassigned from the mines to the lumber yard. Your physical capacity just got updated in the file. This is where we talk about the secret tribute dossier that almost certainly exists for every child. You'd have height and weight charts, medical history, injury reports from district work, early malnutrition flagged in red, then behavior, fights, skipped shifts, who you're caught talking to in the square, family background, Tesserae usage, known political troublemakers, anyone who ever mouthed off within earshot of a peacekeeper. That part matters because the games are never just about one tribute. They're about the network that produced them. And then there's personality. Teachers' notes about who tells stories, who organizes games at recess, who freezes on stage during the school performance. The capital doesn't need you to be happy. It needs to know if you can carry a camera close-up. A shy kid with a tragic family might be tagged underdog potential. A loud, charismatic teenager with a sick sibling, possible lover or martyr arc. A chronic bully, Future monster, keep an eye on temper. You see the extreme version of this in the career districts. 1, 2, and 4 aren't just producing tributes. They're running unofficial academies. Children play Hunger Games with real weapons. Older teens train in obstacle courses that suspiciously resemble capital arenas. Officially, it's all local tradition. But the capital doesn't shut it down. It encourages it. Why? Because those programs function as feeder leagues, and every promising career is basically a walking audition tape the game makers can monitor years ahead. So imagine Plutarch-level strategists sitting in a secure room in the capital, scrolling through district feeds. We're going to cover arena tech later, but here the tech is human. They tag a strong swimmer in 4 at age 10. They flag a coal miner's daughter in 12 who hunts too well. They log a boy in 11 who keeps standing up to peacekeepers. By the time these kids hit the training center, the capital already has a decade of footage and a short list of pre-written roles, which leads to the most unsettling question of all. When Effie Trinket pulls a name, is it really random anymore? Or is the capital simply activating a file it's been building since kindergarten? Because if the tribute pipeline starts that early, the next logical step is even darker. How do you design arenas around people you've been profiling their entire lives, from tesserae to training? How the capital quietly shapes volunteers, so if the capital is building tribute files from kindergarten, you have to ask, where do they find the kids who are most likely to end up in those files? This is where we talk about tesserae. At face value, tesserae are a mercy program. You're hungry, your district can't feed you. So the capital helps by offering grain and oil in exchange for extra entries in the reaping. But here's the real question. Why design relief that permanently brands you and your siblings as higher-risk names in the bowl? Tesserae don't just keep people alive. They quietly sort the population into predictable sacrifice classes. Year after year, the same neighborhoods, the same last names, the same body types are overrepresented. To a game maker, that's not tragedy. That's data. Think about District 12. We know Katniss takes tesserae. So did Gale. That part matters because it shows how the poorest families are pushed into a recurring bargain. Short-term food for long-term danger. The capital can model this. They can estimate how many malnourished, undertrained tributes they'll pull from the seam versus the merchant's children. They know the odds that a volunteer will step in to replace a tesserae kid are basically zero. Tesserae are a pressure valve and a pipeline at the same time. Now flip to Districts 1, 2, and 4. Different districts, same outcome. Instead of tesserae, you get training centers, sponsors, and a whole culture where volunteering is the highest honor. Children are raised on the promise that if you train hard enough, you don't just survive the games, you become a victor and move to your own version of Victor's Village. Parents pay for private combat lessons. Trainers run semi-formal academies, and the reaping is almost ceremonial, because everyone already knows which career is going to shout, "I volunteer." So why build such opposite systems? Hunger over here, glory over there. The reason is that both are just different faces of the same machine. One pipeline is fueled by desperation, the other by ambition, but both feed the arena on schedule. The capital can count on a steady flow of underfed, frightened tributes from tesserae-heavy districts, and a reliable crop of physically prepared, camera-ready careers. There is a lot to uncover here in terms of how that shapes the relationship between each district and the games. And the capital absolutely has incentives layered on top. Districts that produce good television get subtle rewards, slightly better rations, more infrastructure projects, extra coverage that boosts local pride. Districts that send tributes who freeze, cry, or ruin the show. Maybe their supply quotas get stricter. Maybe their victors' perks are quietly reduced. Over decades, that kind of feedback loop teaches a district what behavior is safe and what is punished without ever needing an official policy. Once you zoom out, you see why the game makers can plan storylines years in advance. They know District 1 will send glamorous killers, District 2 will send disciplined tacticians, District 11 will send tall agricultural workers hardened by field labor, District 12 will send coal-dusted outliers who rarely survive. When you can predict the types, you can start designing arenas and narratives around them, long before a specific name is drawn. And that's exactly where we're going to cover next. How those types don't just walk into a random forest, but into arenas that were practically built around their weaknesses. Katniss, the glitch in the system. When the pipeline misfires, those arenas are built around predictable types. So what happens when the type is wrong? This is where we talk about District 12. At face value, it's the control group of the whole system. No career academies, no proud volunteers, just a starving coal district that statistically sends underfed, undertrained kids to die in the opening bloodbath. If you're a game maker planning years out, 12 is the easiest variable. You assume early death, low sponsor interest, minimal narrative weight. Back then, the Capitol's data on District 12 would have been depressingly consistent. You think about tributes like Rue's district counterparts training in orchards, or the brutal polished fighters from 1 and 2. In comparison, 12 sends kids who have to be taught which end of the spear to hold. So why waste a complex arena twist on them? Why design anything around a victor from the seam when the numbers say that almost never happens? And then Katniss says one word: volunteer. Not for glory, not for career advancement, for her little sister. Here's the real question. How do you plan a decade-long narrative pipeline around districts and then account for an act of love that your model doesn't even believe in? The Capitol expects ambition, fear, resentment, but unconditional public self-sacrifice from the poorest district. That part matters because it exposes a blind spot in their entire system. If you pulled Katniss's file from before the reaping, what would you actually see? Repeated hunting violations beyond the fence, which means security reports. Black market activity in the Hob, which means peacekeeper notes about her relationship with Greasy Say and other traders. Maybe even a quiet flag from some board analyst that she's unusually accurate with a bow for a girl from 12. There is a lot to uncover here. But notice what's missing. No history of volunteering in her district. No record of her drawing attention to herself in public. No reason, on paper, to predict she'd override the entire no volunteers from 12 inches baseline and step in for Prim. The Capitol's pipeline reads her as a poacher, not a potential symbol. And that's where the logistical machine starts to misfire. Overnight, stylists who were prepared to sell another tragic, forgettable 12 girl have to pivot to fierce protective sister branding. Interview coaches scramble to turn someone who hates the Capitol into someone who can play along just enough to win sponsors. Media planners rewrite segments to frame her as a curiosity instead of dead air between the real contenders. We're going to cover more of the media side later, but notice how fast the system bends around her. Sponsor pitches shift. She's suddenly marketable to viewers who see a rare promise of genuine hope instead of rehearsed ambition. Even the arena, already built, has to be reinterpreted on the fly to showcase her skills, rather than just her suffering. So here's the lingering question. If one girl from the hungriest district can derail years of narrative planning just by saying, "I volunteer," what does that reveal about how fragile the Capitol's logistical control really is? And what happens when the next anomaly isn't just one girl, but an entire game's mutts, force fields, and labs inside the Capitol's death tech supply chain? And that brings us to the part of the games that feels the least fragile on the surface, the tech. Because if human tributes are unpredictable variables, mutts and force fields are the Capitol's controlled constants. At face value, those wolf mutts in the 74th look like a last-minute horror twist. The horn sounds, the feast is over, and suddenly the arena just grows fangs. But here's the real question. How do you suddenly deploy custom predators that respond to game maker commands and know exactly where to drive the remaining tributes? You don't. That's the point. Those mutts are the final product of a decade-long R&D pipeline. Somewhere in or near the capital, there are genetic labs whose entire purpose is to design, grow, and stress-test living weapons that can survive any arena climate. We're going to cover the logistics behind Victor's village elsewhere, but this is where we talk about the capital's other gated community. Research complexes where scientists run behavioral trials, map response patterns, and then plug those patterns into the same control grid that moves fire, flood, and fog. The 74th game's mutts give the system away. They don't just attack. They wear the dead tribute's eyes, their coloring, even hints of their mannerisms. That part matters because it proves the capital has been collecting DNA from every tribute for decades, storing it in a massive database that can be pulled on command. You can't whip up genetically keyed nightmare dogs overnight. You need blood samples, scans, and psychological profiles ready to be cross-referenced, so that when Kato sees Glimmer's eyes in a snarling muzzle, the horror lands on both him and the audience. So now the question shifts. If they have that level of data, what else are they modeling? Every tribute has a secret file thicker than a capital fashion magazine, and those files don't just sit in a drawer. They're fed into simulations, which mutts will trigger panic, which arena hazards will break a district's morale, which combinations will make a future victor inspiring instead of merely alive. And the mutts are only one layer. Underneath every arena is a buried skeleton of force fields, climate control systems, and holographic projectors. The lightning tree in the quarter quell, the tidal waves, the spinning jungle in Catching Fire. None of that happens without specialized manufacturing centers years in advance. Someone has to build the transparent panels that can stop Katniss's arrow, the generators that keep Johanna from hacking through the dome, the emitters that make a calm blue sky while the temperature quietly drops to lethal. Where do you put that kind of infrastructure? Probably not in District 3, where tech-savvy workers might start asking the wrong questions. More likely, you ring the capital with secure industrial zones, each with its own dedicated peacekeeper regiment whose entire mission is to prevent sabotage. Trains bring in raw ore from the districts, and finished death tech goes back out, disguised as arena renovations or tourist upgrades for old arenas. Here's the twist, though. If any one of those layers fails, if a mutt handler corrupts the code, if a force field factory slows production, if a maintenance crew quietly rebels, can the games still function as propaganda? Or do they suddenly expose what they really are? A massive, over-engineered machine that only works as long as every cog is too afraid to slip. The Silver Parachute's journey, how a single sponsor gift proves a whole system. So let's zoom in on the smallest cog in that machine. One silver parachute. At face value, it's a sweet moment. A worried capital viewer sees a bleeding tribute, taps a screen, and boom, a gift drops from the sky. Instant hope, instant drama. But here's the real question. How many people have to say yes before that parachute ever touches arena air? We start in a capital living room. A sponsor sees their favorite victor in the making stumble. They don't just throw money at the screen. They choose from a pre-approved catalog. That part matters because it tells you the range of spontaneous generosity has already been scripted. No experimental weapons. No untested tech. Just standard, regulated items that fit the story the game makers want. Once the payment goes through, it doesn't jump straight to a hovercraft. It hits a sponsor desk, then a producer queue, then the game maker's console. Why so many layers? Because they have to ask, does this gift break the arena rules? Does it ruin a carefully built relationship between tributes? Does it undermine a capital narrative they've been pushing for days? You're not sending a bandage, you're sending a plot twist. This is where we talk about control. A single vial of medicine can't outsmart the games. So it's checked against the tribute's medical file, the arena's hazard list, even the timing of the next engineered disaster. If a sponsor orders fireproof gear 10 minutes before a planned wildfire, that's not good instincts. That's a request the game makers either delay or deny so they keep the illusion of risk. And behind that decision, there is a lot to uncover here in terms of logistics. The only reason they can respond in real time is because entire warehouses are pre-stocked months in advance. Standardized food rations, generic antibiotics, water purifiers, basic weapons, crated, labeled, and matched to each year's arena theme. You can't have a dramatic midnight drop if someone has to manufacture a burn cream from scratch. So while you're watching Katniss look up at the sky, there's a logistics crew in a hangar pulling the exact parachute shell, attaching the right token from the right district sponsor, syncing it with coordinates from the control room. A pilot has already trained in that arena's air currents, practiced drops on a full-scale mock-up, and rehearsed contingency routes if the force field glitches. By the time the parachute appears on screen, you're seeing the final second of a chain that started long before the games even began. Trained staff rehearsed procedures, stocked inventories, narrative approvals, all compressed into a 2-second shot of falling silver. So when the Capitol sells you the promise that anyone can change a tribute's fate with a single gift, what you're really seeing is the tip of a supply chain iceberg. The generosity is curated, the chaos is managed, and the chance moments that move the story forward, those were prepared years in advance, which raises a darker question. If they can coordinate a bandage that precisely, what else are they coordinating that you never see? Scripted chaos. How the Capitol pre-writes the games like a TV season. So if a single bandage can be timed to the second, what about an entire story? Because the Hunger Games aren't just a death match, they're a prestige TV show with a government budget. Every year has a theme, a tone, a desired emotional arc for the Capitol audience. One Games leans into spectacle and novelty. Another leans into suffering and punishment. At face value, you're watching 24 kids in an arena. But here's the real question. Why does it feel, year after year, like the story always lands exactly where the Capitol wants it to? This is where we talk about season planning. Game makers don't just design one arena, they map out a slate. Somewhere in the training center, there's effectively a multi-year season Bible for the games. It outlines which year gets a jungle, which year gets a frozen wasteland, which year gets a clockwork nightmare. It also sketches the big twist moments and the propaganda beats. This is the year we remind the districts that rebellion is hopeless. This is the year we reward obedience. This is the year we glorify career training. There is a lot to uncover here because that Bible isn't just about terrain, it's about narrative. They plan when to debut new mutts, when to showcase cutting-edge force fields, when to stage a brutal rule enforcement on live television. The arena becomes a set built to deliver a specific political message, and the message has to evolve so the audience doesn't get bored. Remember, the Capitol needs the games to feel fresh without ever feeling fair. And they don't leave that to chance interviews. The stylists, the interviewers, the commentators, they're all briefed long before they ever meet a single tribute. Caesar Flickerman doesn't improvise the entire emotional journey. He gets talking points. Emphasize District 12's tragic poverty. Play up the rivalry between 1 and 2. Sell this tribute as redemption, that 1 as a cautionary tale. The relationship between what you see on stage and what the Capitol wants you to feel is scripted in advance. So where do tributes fit into this? In a way, they're cast into pre-written roles. Tribute files aren't just height, weight, and skill. They're tagged with narrative labels pulled from years of surveillance data. Potential star-crossed lovers, probable underdog, likely villain, comic relief. A tribute with a clean romantic history and high empathy scores. Perfect candidate for a doomed love story. A volatile, aggressive career from District 2, easy to frame as the monster the audience loves to hate. The reason that part matters is that the story Bible comes first. The tributes are slotted in second. When Katniss and Peter arrive, they're not inventing a lover's narrative from scratch. They're sliding into a template the Capitol has already prepared, one meant to renew the promise of hope while still ending in control. But here's the problem. In the 74th games, there's a single decision that doesn't match any template we've seen before, a moment where you can almost hear the script snap in half and watch the Capitol scramble to rewrite the season live. We're going to cover that fracture point next, and why it terrified Snow more than any mutt ever could. Pattern interrupt. When the script breaks, the berry scene is a logistical failure. So let's snap the camera in, hard to the moment where all that planning stops mattering. 2 kids, 2 berries, and suddenly the most tightly scripted show in Panem turns into a live crisis meeting. At face value, the Nightlock standoff is romantic desperation, Katniss and Peter refusing to kill each other. That's the version the Capitol will eventually package. But here's the real question. What does that moment look like from the control room, from the people who have spent years turning this arena into a guaranteed story with a guaranteed victor? Remember the setup. They've already pulled a huge narrative swing, changing the rules mid-games so 2 tributes from the same district can win. That promise is not just for Katniss and Peter, it's for every viewer in every district who has started to hope, just a little, that the games can bend. When Claudius Templesmith reverses that rule and tells them to kill each other, that part matters because it's the Capitol yanking the leash back. And then Katniss raises the berries. There is a lot to uncover here. You can feel the delay. They don't cut the feed. They don't instantly send in hovercrafts or mutts. For several long seconds, we just watch 2 tributes count together, holding poison that could wipe out the entire season's payoff. That pause is your window into backstage chaos, conflicting orders, producers shouting over each other, Seneca Crane doing mental math on the relationship between fear and spectacle. What's the bigger disaster? A games with no victor, or a games where 2 tributes outsmart the rules on air? In that control room, every long-term plan is suddenly on trial. The arena infrastructure, the mutations, the sponsor segments, the pre-written commentary about tragic lovers doomed by the system, all of it is about to end in a black screen and 2 dead kids. This is where we talk about raw, unscripted risk. If both tributes die, the Capitol doesn't just lose a propaganda victory. It proves the games can be broken from below. So the rule change gets reversed again, not because of mercy, but because the numbers don't work. 1 dead tribute is a tragedy they can spin. 2 dead tributes by joint choice is a question they can't answer. And that single decision forces a retroactive rewrite of the entire narrative. Suddenly, Katniss and Peter aren't just doomed lovers. They're defiant victors who must be contained, monitored in their new homes, paraded through their districts while the Capitol quietly prepares punishment. Snow will turn this into a long game. Threats, Victor's village isolation, the quarter quell. But it all starts with berries on the ground. So if 1 handful of fruit can almost collapse years of planning, what does the Capitol do next? What protocols exist for when a tribute doesn't follow the emotional script? In the next section, we're going to cover the security and contingency side of the games, the kill switches, backup plans, and silent systems built precisely so this never happens again. 3 ways to kill the feed. Security protocols you never see on screen. Those berries don't just threaten a love story. They threaten the broadcast itself. Because here's the real question. Does a regime this paranoid really run the Hunger Games as a truly live event, with no safety net, and just hope no one turns it into open rebellion on air? At face value, it looks spontaneous. Tributes scream, cannons fire, Claudius Templesmith reacts in real time. But a system built on fear doesn't trust chaos. It rehearses it. So we're going to cover the 3 ways the capital can kill the games without ever admitting they've lost control. First, the obvious. 1. Cut the feed. We actually see a softer version of this in the riot after Rue's death in District 11. One moment you're watching Katniss honor a fallen girl. The next, the screen jumps. Commentary stutters, and suddenly we're back to capital-approved angles. There is a lot to uncover here. That cut tells you there's a real-time censorship grid, with technicians trained to slam a visual panic button the second a district starts cheering for the wrong hero. The second option is even more insidious, switching to pre-recorded footage. Imagine a bank of neutral arena shots, trees swaying empty fields, hovercraft in the clouds, ready to loop while peacekeepers crack down off-screen. If a tribute makes a speech that questions the games, you cut the audio, roll a replay of their last acceptable moment, and have Caesar Flickerman narrate over it as if nothing happened. The audience at home never sees the hesitation, only the edited promise of control and hope the capital wants them to feel. And then there's the nuclear option, faking outcomes. If a tribute escapes the force field, if an explosion takes out a whole camera sector, you don't admit the arena broke. You splice together surviving footage, declare an official victor, and quietly terminate anyone who knows the difference. That part matters because the entire relationship between capital and district rests on the games being inevitable, unbreakable, almost sacred. The second you admit the arena can fail, the myth of capital perfection cracks. So what happens if the arena itself becomes the battlefield? This is where we talk about backup arenas and extraction. We know arenas are permanent, high-tech facilities kept as tourist sites. It's not hard to imagine at least one cold arena on standby every year, with basic mutts and traps already tested. If an external attack hits the current games, hovercraft could yank surviving tributes, drop them into a simpler kill zone, and present it as a dramatic twist rather than an emergency. All of this only works if there's muscle behind the curtain. Off-screen, there are almost certainly peacekeeper regiments and capital special forces ringed around every arena, out beyond the tree line. Their job isn't to entertain you, it's to make sure no district militia reaches the control center, no rogue tribute disappears into the wild, and no hijacked signal turns the games into free advertising for rebellion. So if the capital has kill switches, fake feeds, backup arenas, and hidden armies, how did the 75th game still end with the sky shattered, the arena gone, and Katniss literally extracted on live television? In the next section, we're going to cover how the rebels turned those very safeguards against the capital, and why the system cracked from the inside out. District 1, 2, 4 versus everyone else. Why the system loves careers. So if the rebels could hijack the arena itself, what does that say about the tributes the capital expects to put in there? Because the system isn't just building force fields and mutts years in advance. It's building people. And some districts are clearly built to win. This is where we talk about districts 1, 2, and 4. The career districts. At face value, they're just better at the games, right? Stronger kids, more volunteers, more victors. But here's the real question. Why does the capital's entire incentive structure bend around this specific tribute type? Why are these the districts that end up with the most mansions in Victor's village? Think about the unofficial training centers. On paper, they're not supposed to exist. Children are not meant to be trained for the arena. In practice, you have semi-legal combat academies where 12-year-olds are running obstacle courses and ranking each other's kill times. The capital knows. They fund the peacekeepers who walk past those doors every day. If Snow really wanted it to stop, it would stop. So why tolerate it? Because those centers are a pipeline. They guarantee a steady supply of tributes who already understand the cameras, already buy into the promise that the games are an opportunity instead of a sentence. There is a lot to uncover here about logistics and narrative. When game makers are sketching out storylines years ahead, they need reliable archetypes. Careers give them that. District 1 polishes the glamorous villain. District 2 supplies the loyal enforcer. District 4 can be the charming crowd pleaser who still knows how to gut you. You can almost see the pre-written commentary cards. Trained since childhood, favorite to win, future victor if they play it right. Now contrast that with the mid-tier and poorer districts, districts 5, 6, 9, 10, 12. Their tributes are pulled from factory floors, coal mines, fields. No training centers, no curated combat culture, no semi-legal academies. The capital's surveillance files on them are still thick. But what's in them? Malnutrition reports. Discipline notes. Maybe a school fight or two. From a showrunner's perspective, they're random. They can be brave or clever, but they're not guaranteed to be camera-ready. And that unevenness is not a bug, it's the feature. It lets the capital pre-plan every season with built-in underdogs and built-in villains. You know the audience will boo when a pack of careers corners the terrified kid from District 10. You know they'll cheer if a scrawny tribute from 12 pulls off an impossible shot. That part matters because it makes the games feel fair emotionally, while remaining rigged structurally. The deeper reason is loyalty. If you grow up in 1, 2, or 4, volunteering looks rational. Your district celebrates its victors. You see real wealth in Victor's Village, real parties, real food coming in when someone wins. The games become a career path. In 12, the reaping is a death lottery. In 2, it's a recruitment drive. So when the capital is planning arenas and arcs years ahead, they're not just counting on technology, they're counting on the careers to keep believing. The real tension we're going to cover next is what happens when even those perfect tributes stop playing their assigned roles. The invisible middle, what we don't see in Districts 5, 6, 9, and 10. So when the careers start slipping, where does the capital turn next? Not to District 12, not even to District 2. It turns to the invisible middle. Because here's the real question. We spend 3 books inside Katniss's head, bouncing between the seam and the capital, and we almost never see what the games mean in Districts 5, 6, 9, and 10. That part matters because our entire sense of Panem is filtered through the poorest coal town and the richest city, which means the middle gets flattened into background. At face value, those districts are just labels: power, transport, grain, livestock. But if the games are a national project, you don't just need glamorous careers and tragic miners. You need the people who keep the lights on. District 5 is literally generating the energy that powers the force fields, the climate controls, the hidden elevators that make arenas function years after they're retired into tourist traps. Every time a game maker spins a dial and summons a firestorm, someone in 5 designed that grid load on a screen. District 6 is doing the same thing with motion instead of voltage. Those high-speed tribute trains, the ones that arrive exactly on cue. No breakdowns, no delays. That's a whole industrial ecosystem in 6, tuned around the reaping calendar. We're going to cover the long-term arena planning later, but you can already see the relationship. If the capital knows the 78th games will be in a jungle arena, they know 10 years earlier exactly how many trains, fuel cells, and spare parts they'll be quietly ordering from 6. So what does games culture look like in a place that's essential but never celebrated? Probably not the worship you see in 1 and 2, but also not the open dread of 12. This is where we talk about grim routine. The reaping happens, the train leaves, the factories don't stop. Maybe there's one viewing hall with a decent screen and power that never cuts, because of course, District 5's broadcast can't go dark during the finale. Do they have volunteers? Not in droves. But imagine the occasional tribute stepping forward in 5 or 6, not because they're bred for glory, but because being chosen might mean their family gets an upgraded apartment block or their name on a power station. In 9 and 10, where grain and cattle are endlessly replaceable, you can picture a different calculation. A bored foreman's kid, a desperate merchant, someone who thinks 1 in 24 is still better odds than dying in a threshing machine. Here's the real question. How does the capital make that kind of quiet risk feel worth it? The answer is soft rewards. Nothing as obvious as Victor's village, but patterns everyone notices. A district that produces a crowd-pleasing tribute gets an unexplained bump in rations that winter. A new clinic opens near the square after a year, with especially dramatic deaths. A power outage in 5 is fixed overnight if their tribute makes the top 8. Over time, that's how the games stop being just a capital spectacle and start sinking into every district's economy and psychology. You're not just shipping power or wheat, you're part of the machine that makes the arena possible. And the real tension we have to track next is what happens when those mid-tier districts realize they're not just supporting the games, they're indispensable to them. Hopeful monsters. How volunteer culture is engineered. Not organic, and once those districts understand they're indispensable, a new problem appears for the capital. What if the people you need stop being afraid enough to cooperate? This is where we talk about volunteers, because here's the real question. If the games are supposed to be punishment and control, why allow volunteering at all? Wouldn't it be cleaner to pull 2 random names, shut the door, and tell every district there is no escape? No heroic sibling swap. No ambitious career stepping forward. Just pure random terror. At face value, that sounds more efficient. Total unpredictability. Maximum dread. So why doesn't the capital do it? The reason is that terror alone is unstable. You can't run a system for 75 years on fear without something else to cushion it. Snow understands there has to be a promise buried inside the threat, or people stop playing the game. Volunteer culture in the career districts is that promise. It's not an accident that districts 1, 2, and 4 just happen to produce kids who train from childhood, dream of sponsorships, and sprint to the stage when a weaker name is called. There is a lot to uncover here, because what looks like organic district culture is actually a long-term capital design choice. Careers turn the arena into an opportunity. You're told that if you're strong enough, fast enough, cruel enough, the games are not just a death sentence, they're a career path. Win, become a victor, move to Victor's village, and your entire district gets showers of food and celebrations. That part matters because it reframes the relationship between district and arena. You're not just terrified of being chosen, you're tempted to want it. That temptation solves logistical problems. Reapings in career districts are smoother, almost festive. Fewer parents are screaming because the tribute on stage often wanted to be there, or can at least be sold as prepared. The capital doesn't have to drag half-starved kids out of the crowd. It gets tributes who have been informally conditioned for years, which makes the games easier to stage and more visually impressive. It also makes the narrative pipeline cleaner. Ambitious careers give the commentators ready-made storylines, rivalries, alliances, training backstories. When you've already profiled a district's top prospects through surveillance and pre-gamed data, you can write the arcs in advance. The games start to resemble a prestige TV series more than a lottery execution. But the psychological genius is this. By letting some kids choose the arena, the capital can pretend the games are partly about merit and bravery. Snow can point to volunteers and say, "See, it's not just oppression, it's competition, it's honor." The existence of even a small group who rush toward the stage blurs the moral lines for everyone watching. So why even allow volunteers? Because they are hopeful monsters. Engineered products of a system that mixes fear with just enough hope to keep the machine running. And this is exactly where we pivot next, from how the capital moves bodies and supplies to Snow's core political theory about how much hope you can safely give a district before it starts to burn the arena down. Why not just execute people? The meta question behind the games. So if volunteers are engineered by the system, here's the real question. Why even bother with the system at all? If the capital's goal is to scare every district into permanent submission, why not skip the arenas, skip the mutts, skip the TV, and just execute people in the square every year? On paper, that sounds more efficient. No force fields to maintain. No decade-long R&D pipeline for mutts. No need to build a rainforest death maze and then convert it into a tourist destination. You could imagine a simpler Pan-Am where, on reaping day, the peacekeepers just line up dissidents, pull the trigger, and call it a lesson. At face value, raw terror should work. But this is where we talk about stability. Public executions are a blunt instrument. They create fear, yes, but they also create martyrs. You watch your neighbor, your cousin, your old mine partner shot for some vague rebellious activity, and your anger has nowhere to go except up the chain, straight at the capital. There is no outlet, no game, no victor. Just a pile of resentment that quietly compounds year after year. So imagine a hypothetical alternative Pan-Am. No Hunger Games, just annual executions in every district, broadcast or not. No spectacle, no sponsors, no chance at reward. Would people be scared? Absolutely. But what story are they being told? The story is simply, you are powerless and you will always be powerless. There is a lot to uncover here, because that kind of message is actually risky long-term. When you tell people they have zero chance, you push them toward desperation. Desperate people revolt, even when it looks suicidal. The capital understands that the most stable form of control isn't pure fear. It's fear carefully braided with the tiniest thread of hope. That part matters because the games do something executions can't. They offer a rigged, bloody lottery ticket. The Hunger Games solve multiple problems at once. They punish past rebellion by taking children. They entertain the capital with a prestige television-level production, complete with pre-written storylines and controlled spontaneity. And crucially, they redirect district anger inward. Instead of all 12 districts hating the capital together, District 4 is busy resenting 2's careers, 11 is mourning Rue, 12 is fixated on whether their tribute can finally win. Every logistical piece we've been talking about serves that emotional engineering. Arenas built years in advance aren't just infrastructure. They're long-term investments in reliable catharsis. The tribute pipeline, the surveillance files thicker than a capital fashion magazine, the sponsor system that turns suffering into betting odds, all of it manages the emotional economy of Pan-Am. Who gets fear? Who gets envy? Who gets just enough hope to keep playing? So why does Snow pour decades into this machine instead of cheaper firing squads? Because he isn't just managing bodies, he's managing belief. And to understand why the capital is willing to spend so much to manufacture that belief, we have to talk about Snow's favorite word, hope. Hope, carefully controlled, Snow's political theory is an engineering blueprint. Snow actually tells us the blueprint himself. In that garden scene with Seneca Crane trimming his perfect white roses, he says, hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. At face value, it sounds poetic. But here's the real question. What if that line is not just a theme? It's the engineering spec sheet for the entire Hunger Games machine? This is where we talk about logistics as political theory. Snow isn't a random tyrant who happens to enjoy televised murder. He's a systems designer. When he says, a little hope, he's talking about measurable quantities. How many victors per district, how visible their wealth is, how often sponsor gifts arrive, how many volunteers you get from the careers each year. Every one of those variables can be tuned up or down to adjust the relationship between terror and aspiration. Think about victors first. One winner, one mansion, one pipeline of capital luxury flowing into a starving district. You can see the promise from the seam or the hob, but you can't touch it. That part matters because it proves survival is possible. Not likely, just possible. The long-term arena investments, the permanent force fields, the tourist packages that keep those arenas open for decades, those aren't just for entertainment. They're monuments to the message. If you win the games, this world opens for you. Now add sponsor gifts. On screen, they look spontaneous, emotional, almost chaotic. In reality, they require factories, storage, flight paths, and a control room that decides which parachute drops when. Why not just let tributes die faster and save on medicine and bread? Because each silver parachute is a tiny, glittering dose of hope. You, watching from the district, see that the capital might notice you, might like you, might save you, if you play along. Then there's volunteering and the career culture. Back then, the early games leaned harder on raw fear. Names drawn, children dragged. No escape. So why the change to a system where some kids beg to go? Because a volunteer doesn't just fear death. They chase the promise of being a victor. Districts 1, 2, and 4 become proof-of-concept labs that Snow's formula works. Train hard, embrace the games, maybe you get out. Contrast that with mass executions. Pure fear. No cameras, no sponsor segments, no parades, no chance. It's cheaper, sure, but it doesn't create the same psychological economy. Why build decade-long R&D pipelines for mutts? Why maintain arenas as clockwork death traps? Why profile every child in Panem years before they're reaped? Because the games are fear-wrapped in a glittering layer of possibility. You don't just dread them. You plan around them, fantasize about beating them, bet on them. And once you see that, every logistical choice we've covered snaps into focus. Permanent arenas mean permanent symbols. Tribute profiling means the capital can script underdog arcs without ever letting the odds truly slip. Even the backup protocols, flood the arena, kill the feed, gas the tributes, are there to make sure hope never tips into dangerous. So when Snow trims those roses and talks about hope, he's not being philosophical, he's reviewing a system. The real question now is, what happens when one girl with a berry stunt forces that system to overdose on its own hope? Victors as living billboards, the long-term ROI of one surviving tribute. So when one girl weaponizes berries and turns a little hope into open defiance, what does the capital do with her? They do the same thing they've always done. They try to turn her into an asset. This is where we talk about victors as long-term investments, not one-season winners. Because the games don't just plan for 24 tributes this year. They plan for one survivor who will keep paying dividends for the next 40 years. As a mentor, as a celebrity, as a warning, as a walking advertisement that the system works. At face value, the payoff looks simple. You win, you get a house in Victor's village, endless food, and you never face the reaping again. The district sees someone from their own streets eating capital pastries for breakfast. Hope, right? But here's the real question. Why does the capital pour so many resources into one person who can't even go back into the arena? The reason is return on investment. A single victor appears in every reaping broadcast, every train departure, every pre-games interview. They mentor new tributes, shaping them into better entertainment products, and in the career districts, into more lethal contenders. Snow doesn't just get one season of ratings out of Kato or Finnick or Johanna. He gets decades of cameos, talk show appearances, propaganda specials about overcoming the odds. That part matters because Victor's village is the physical proof of the capital's promise. You can point to those houses on the hill and say, see, the games are fair. Anyone can rise. The relationship between district and victor becomes a constant advertisement. Here's the coal miner's daughter who now has hot water and electric lights when the seam goes dark. Children grow up literally staring at that roofline and asking, "Why not me?" But there is a lot to uncover here, because the reward is also a leash. Victors are integrated into the logistics of future games so tightly that retirement is a joke. They sit through strategy sessions with new tributes. They film training segments. They record scripted commentary for capital broadcasts. Some of them, especially the clever or broken ones, end up informally advising game makers, providing insight on what tributes fear, what districts will find especially cruel, what twist will trend, and underneath the glamour, their surveillance nodes. Every victor has a direct line to the capital. That sounds generous until you realize those calls go both ways. Peacekeepers ask, "What are people saying?" Any talk of rebellion, Haymitch's drunkenness, Johanna's rage, Finnick's secrets, those are all reactions to being turned into informants, or punished when they refuse. We're going to cover the psychological side later, but structurally, the capital is building a tiny elite class in every district that owes everything to the games. Food, family safety, medical care, status, all contingent on staying useful. You don't just fear losing your life anymore, you fear losing your village. So what happens when those billboards start glitching? When victors stop selling the promise and start broadcasting something else entirely? The nicest house in a starving town. Visible rewards as a logistics tool. So when those broadcasts start to slip, the capital needs something you can't turn off with a remote. A street. Victor's village is that street. The nicest house in a starving town. On permanent display. At face value, it's simple. Win the Hunger Games. Get a mansion with working appliances, hot water, and a pantry that actually stays full. But here's the real question. Why invest in luxury suburbs in every poor district instead of just wiring victors a quiet bank account in the capital? This is where we talk about visible rewards as infrastructure. In every district, the village is physically set apart. In 12, it's on a hill, a neat row of 12 identical houses, brand new, with glass windows and electricity that doesn't flicker. You walk past the seams collapsing shacks or the Hobbs stalls, and then you see it. Perfect lawns, paved streets, a house for every victor, even though most of them will never be lived in. That part matters because the emptiness is part of the message. The capital has already built your dream. You just have to survive the arena to move in. And it's not just the winners who get a taste. Every time a district produces a victor, the whole place gets a temporary upgrade. Extra food parcels arrive. There are feasts in the square, grain and oil and sweets that most people haven't seen in months. For one night, the games feel worth it. Your neighbor's child died, but your siblings aren't hungry. So what do you remember more next year when the reaping rolls around? The horror in the arena or the bread on the table? We're going to cover the deeper logistics here, because there is a lot to uncover here. Those houses aren't thrown together after a win. They're pre-built, wired, stocked, and maintained years in advance, waiting for victors who statistically may never exist. District 12 has space for 12 victors. Before Katniss and Peter, only 2 of those houses are occupied. The capital is paying to keep 10 empty mansions powered, cleaned, and ready. That's not generosity. That's long-term psychological planning. Think about the supply chains required. Reliable electricity in a place where most people can't keep a single light on. Regular food deliveries to the village when the rest of the district is on ration cards. Repair crews who show up when a victor's shower breaks, while miners die from untreated injuries. The relationship is brutally clear. The capital can fix anything. It just chooses where. And every child can see it. You grow up walking past those houses, knowing one path, Tesserae, mine, early grave, or the other path, arena, trauma, but maybe a warm bed. The capital doesn't want you hoping for revolution. It wants you hoping for a victor. Hope gets narrowed down to a single address at the edge of town. So when you step back, the nicest house in the starving district isn't a reward. It's a billboard you can never stop reading. The next question is, how do you keep that billboard shining even when the victor inside starts to crack? Tourist traps and time bombs. Arenas as theme parks after the games, you keep that billboard shining by making sure the games never really leave. Not the arena. Not the story. Not the bodies. Because here's the real question. What happens to 100 million credit Murder Dome after the cannons stop? You don't bulldoze it. You turn it into a theme park. Canon actually tells us this outright. Arenas become tourist attractions. Capital citizens take vacations to walk the same blood-stained cornucopia, to pose on the rock where a favorite tribute died, to sip cocktails while pointing out, oh, that's where the mutts came up. At face value, it sounds morbid, but for the capital, it's efficient. You've already spent years building a high-tech ecosystem with force fields, mutts, and climate controls. Why let that investment sit idle 11 months of the year? This is where we talk about logistics. Once an arena becomes a destination, the games turn into permanent infrastructure. You need transport schedules, bringing in tour groups, luxury shuttles landing where hovercraft once scooped up bodies, security perimeters so no drunk capital tourist wanders into an undeactivated trap. And you know at least some of those traps stay live on purpose. There is a lot to uncover here, literally and figuratively. Guided tours don't just happen. Someone writes the script. Every stop gets a curated narrative. Here's where a clever career from District 2 proved the capital rewards strength. Here's where a desperate kid from a seam district tragically failed to secure sponsorship. Same death, different story. The reason that matters is propaganda. You're not just selling tickets. You're selling the official interpretation of what those deaths meant. So the arena becomes a second revenue stream and a second wave of messaging. The broadcast is phase 1, live terror, live spectacle, live betting. The tourist phase is quieter but deeper. It turns the games into a pilgrimage industry. You go to remember your favorite victor. You go to re-feel the fear, but safely, with a guide and a commemorative snack. The relationship between citizen and games shifts from viewer to customer, and customers are easier to program than rebels. And who keeps all of this running? The capital doesn't dirty its own hands with maintenance. Here's the real question. Which district is forced to send technicians to service the force fields? Which district's lumber keeps the viewing platforms fresh? Which district's children grow up knowing their parents are shipped off each season to clean bloodstains tourists aren't supposed to see? The arenas become another invisible factory line, pulling labor and resources into the game's economy long after the victor's crown has been placed. That part matters because it means the games aren't a yearly event. They're a permanent industry, with permanent workers, permanent shrines, permanent trauma. The arenas stand as monuments to capital power you can book for a weekend getaway. So what happens when the rebellion stops aiming at the broadcast and starts aiming at the monuments themselves? If arenas are permanent and victors are permanent, what does it look like when those two time bombs finally go off in the same place? Books versus movies. What adaptation choices reveal about capital logistics? And this is where we talk about the weird split-screen effect between your experience of the games and the capitals. In the books, you're trapped in Katniss's head. Smoke in your lungs. Mud under your nails. Half the time she doesn't even know why the anthem cuts short. But on screen, we suddenly jump into a glass-walled control room where a guy drags a slider and an entire forest catches fire. At face value, that's just adaptation doing its job. Internal panic turns into external spectacle. But here's the real question. What do those cinematic choices accidentally reveal about how the system actually runs? Because once you see Seneca Crane casually summoning firewalls with a touchpad, you can't pretend the arena is some improvised nightmare. It's infrastructure. Think about the 74th games in the movie. Katniss runs toward the edge of the arena, and the control room spins up a literal wall of fire that hurts her back. In the book, she just experiences heat, smoke, confusion, and pain. She has no reason to imagine buried fuel lines, sensor grids, or automated wind controls. The film shows you banks of screens, holographic maps, and game makers dropping digital fireballs onto a 3D model. That part matters because it confirms what the text only implies. Those natural disasters are pre-installed tested systems, not last-minute whims. Same thing with the mutts. On the page, Katniss is so terrified she can't pass how they were made, only that the eyes resemble the dead tributes. In the movie, we cut straight to the launch bay. Hatches open, mutts deploy on cue. You're watching a pipeline. DNA records, behavioral profiles, containment protocols, all boiled down into a single button press. There is a lot to uncover here about the relationship between horror and logistics. The more instantaneous it looks on screen, the more years of R&D you have to assume underneath. Then there's the quarter-quell clock arena. In the book, Katniss pieces it together slowly, one deadly wedge at a time. In the film, Plutarch stands in front of a glowing hologram, rotating the entire arena with a flick of his hand. It screams centralized year-round operations. This isn't a seasonal pop-up event. This is a permanent command center, with staff working shifts, maintaining force fields, weather controls, and backup systems even when no tribute is bleeding on the sand. So why does the movie make it look so easy? Pacing. You can't spend 10 minutes watching a mid-level technician reboot the lightning tree. We get a handful of glamorous operators instead of the hundreds of engineers, security officers, and bureaucrats a setup like this would really demand. But if the on-screen version already needs a full control room, a realistic version would be an entire campus. And here's the twist. Both versions are probably underestimating the scale. The book hides the machinery behind Katniss's fear. The films compress it for spectacle. The truth in universe, a bureaucracy so big that even the head game maker is just the visible tip of a very cold, very efficient iceberg. So if the games need that much permanent infrastructure, what does that mean for how early they start building the arena around specific tributes and specific rebellions? A day in the life of a game maker, running a decade-long death project. So if the arena is already being wired years before a specific tribute is chosen, what does an ordinary day look like for the people running that machine? You picture Seneca Crane sipping coffee in front of a hologram map. But here's the real question. Who built that map? Who maintains it? And who's already designing the arena Katniss will never see? This is where we talk about the game maker department as an actual workplace. At face value, you see one head game maker on screen. In reality, there is a lot to uncover here. Long-term R&D labs buried under the Capitol, arena-specific project managers juggling budgets and mutt inventories, and a live operations floor that's basically mission control for the current games. One team is testing new force fields on condemned prisoners. Another is arguing over the color palette of the next firestorm. Think about a typical year. While the live ops staff are watching heart rates and camera feeds for, say, the 70-second games, a different group is already walking through the 78th arena in VR, stress-testing weather systems and sponsor gift drop points. The 74th games, probably locked years earlier, with engineers running simulations on which tree Katniss might climb even before she can walk back in District 12. That part matters, because it means every spontaneous disaster is the end of a decade-long Gantt chart. And all of this has to answer to snow. That's the constant balancing act. Every morning, briefing is 3 competing columns: the president's political goals, Capitol audience ratings, and the cold technical constraints of what the arena can actually do without collapsing. You want to punish a rebellious district? Great. But can the power grid handle another 24-hour lightning storm? Can you flood a quadrant without shorting the cameras that sell the story? Inside that pressure cooker, internal politics get vicious. Promotions aren't about seniority. They're about spectacle. Your MUT rollout boosted ratings. You get a bigger arena next cycle. Your twist confuses viewers, or worse, sympathizes a district. You start wondering if that security escort after the debrief is really about congratulations. Everyone remembers Seneca. His execution turns every staff meeting into a quiet referendum on how far to push innovation without losing control. So a junior game maker's day is a career path, not a one-off project. Morning. Monitor a minor avalanche in the current games and file a report on why one tribute's death didn't spike viewership as projected. Afternoon. Sit in a concept meeting for an arena scheduled 10 years out, taking notes on how its layout could showcase a future victor from a favored district. Evening. Update long-term profiles on promising careers, because the relationship between arena and tribute starts long before the reaping. And when the arena shuts down for the year, the department doesn't sleep. It just rolls over to the next deadline. Which raises the next question. If this machine is always running, how early do they start quietly shaping the tributes themselves to fit the stories they've already planned? From age 5 to the reaping, walking through a career tribute's life. So let's answer that. How early do they start? In District 2, the answer is about the time you're learning to tie your shoes. Picture a 5-year-old named Cassian. At face value, he's just another quarry kid racing other children across broken stone, jumping from block to block. But this is where we talk about how play in a career district is already a training module. The balance beams are old scaffolds. The tag game is capture the flag with wooden swords. And the local instructor who laughs when he falls, she's quietly noting his coordination, his pain tolerance, who he follows, and who he bosses around. By 8, those games stop pretending. Cassian's parents sign him up for a capital-approved youth program in the district's training center. On paper, it's fitness and discipline. In reality, it's an unofficial pre-games academy. Peacekeepers drift through the gym, supposedly for security, but they linger near the sparring mats, watching which kids keep getting back up. Every bruise, every broken finger, every time Cassian refuses to yield is a data point. The instructor files weekly reports that don't just stay in District 2, they travel. Here's the real question. Why does the capital care about a scrawny 8-year-old's push-up count? Because by the time he's reaping age, they don't want a mystery, they want a profile. So when Cassian hits 12, his school day includes mandatory combat drills, endurance runs in the quarry dust, and capital-approved history lessons that praise famous victors from his district. The message is simple. Volunteering isn't just allowed, it's honorable. It's the one way a child from the stone dust can step into marble. That part matters because the culture finishes what the curriculum starts. Neighbors still talk about Cato as if he's a war hero, not a dead teenager. Victor's village sits on its little rise, visible from Cassian's walk to class every morning. The promise is right there. Win, and your family never has to take Tesserae again. You can feel how the relationship between district and games gets flipped. The fear shifts from being chosen to being overlooked. Meanwhile, his file thickens. Training scores from local tournaments. Discipline notes when he mouths off to a peacekeeper but doesn't back down. Medical records from a dislocated shoulder that he insists on popping back into place mid-match. Even his social behavior gets logged. Does he protect weaker kids or humiliate them? All of it is quietly tagged under his name in some capital database, ready to be pulled the second he raises his hand. So when the reaping comes at 17, and the smaller boy's name is drawn, Cassian stepping forward isn't a sudden burst of courage. It's the end of a decade-long sentence. The crowd expects it. The peacekeepers don't flinch. The escort is already smiling because this is the story they were hoping to sell, the confident career who chooses the arena. He boards the train with a duffel bag and a lifetime of data. And here's the question we're going to cover next. Now that the Capital has spent years scripting him, how much of Cassian's games is already written? And how much can he still break on live television? Living in the arena's shadow, day-to-day life under the games machine. Because here's the twist. Cassian's games were already running before he was even born. Not the arena itself, not the cameras. The calendar. The trains. The way your entire district's year bends around that 1 week in July, when 2 names are pulled, and everything stops breathing at once. This is where we talk about living under a schedule built for an execution you might never see, but can never escape. Every district has its own harvests, shifts, and quotas, but the reaping sits in the middle like a black hole. School years end just before it. Peacekeeper rotations spike just after it. Transport schedules flex so that coal, grain, textiles, and fresh tributes all hit the rails on time. You think you're just catching the 5 a.m. train to the mines. That train exists because the Capital needs ore smelted into force field pylons before next year's arena install. The timetable is a countdown clock. You're just using it to get to work. And here's the real question. What does an ordinary industry even mean in Panem when everything ultimately serves the games? At face value, District 8 makes fabric, District 10 raises livestock, District 3 does tech. Useful, sure, but there is a lot to uncover here. Those bolts of silk and sequins. They don't just go to Fashion Week, they become tribute parade costumes, interview gowns, and Capital crowd outfits. The wiring and microchips from 3 don't only power city lights, they vanish into underground control rooms that can spin a jungle into a firestorm on command. District 1's luxury goods feed sponsor gifts. District 4's fish and grain from 11 help stage, the cornucopia feasts. Even the lumber from 7 might end up as arena trees, carefully engineered to fall on cue. That part matters because it means the normal economy is basically a supply chain wrapped around a murder show, and everyone knows it. That's the psychological knife. You're in District 12, picking your way through slag heaps, and somewhere in the back of your mind you know, right now, engineers in the Capital are pouring concrete for a bloodbath your future child could stand in. The arena you see on TV at 16 might be the same facility your name drags you into at 18. How do you plan a life under that? Do you have kids? Do you hoard, train, pray? There's no safe answer, only different ways of rehearsing your own terror. But even if you never get reaped, you're still drafted. As a viewer, as a worker, as one more body in a Capital crowd shot, screaming on cue while a hovercraft lifts a corpse. The relationship is total. You sew the flags, you mine the metal, you watch the broadcast, you cheer for the victor who will never be free. So when we say the game's logistics aren't separate from Panem's society, we're not being metaphorical. The games are the organizing principle. Everything else is a side quest. Which raises one more question we're going to cover next. If an entire nation has been engineered around keeping the arena running, what does it actually take to break that machine without being crushed in its gears first? Designing each district's plug-in. How local economies feed the games if the whole nation is one giant machine keeping the arena running. Then each district is a plug-in module. You pull one out, what actually happens? Does the screen go dark? Or does the Capital just reroute the power and keep the show going? This is where we talk about District 3. At face value, you're told it's technology, vague, harmless. But start mapping it onto the games, and it snaps into focus fast. Someone has to manufacture the cameras buried in every tree, the micro mics in every leaf, the control chips for force fields, launch platforms, and those timing mechanisms that let Gamemakers spin whole arenas on a clock. That's not a hobby project in a capital basement. That's an industrial pipeline. You can picture it. Anonymous factory floors in District 3 turning out surveillance components for some unnamed government contract. Workers soldering boards that will become the eyes tracking every tribute, including their own children. And here's the real question. How many of them actually know that the circuit they're testing is going to end up in the arena, and not in a weather satellite or border sensor the Capitol invented as a cover story? Then, you plug in District 6, transport. We always focus on the trains that bring tributes in, but the games rely on an entire hidden fleet. Hovercraft to scoop up bodies, supply drops to appear at just the right dramatic moment, maintenance crews to keep everything fueled and flight-ready. The relationship between District 6 and the arena is probably written as defense logistics on the paperwork. But the reason those engines have to be flawless is so no much release, no cannon fire, is ever delayed on live television. District 5 is the power strip. You don't run a fully artificial ecosystem, force fields, mutt labs, and a 24/7 broadcast without dedicated energy lines. So you imagine massive generation facilities with priority grids that feed straight to capital broadcast centers and the active arena. Backup generators, tested on a schedule the districts are told is for national security drills. That part matters because it means even if one plant goes down, the games stay lit. The promise of uninterrupted punishment cannot fail. District 8 looks softer on paper. Textiles. But someone has to sew peacekeeper uniforms, tribute parade costumes, arena staff jumpsuits, and the endless banners and flags draped over every surface. Fashion becomes a weapon. Every stitch reinforces the story the Capitol wants you to see. Obedient victors in shining outfits, unified districts under one logo, no visible fraying at the edges. And again, how much do those workers really know? You can imagine an order form that just says, ceremonial garments, high priority event. They see white fabric, not peacekeeper armor. They see colorful capes, not the opening act of a death show. So, here's the strategic question buried under all of this. If District 3 sabotaged camera chips, or District 6 slowed hovercraft repairs, or District 5 had a maintenance error on a key line, could one coordinated strike actually cripple the games? Or has the Capitol already built in redundant suppliers, backup districts, and hidden capital-only facilities so that no single region can pull the plug? There is a lot to uncover here, because once you start thinking in terms of failure points, you're not just mapping how the games work, you're mapping where a rebellion would have to hit simultaneously. And next, we're going to cover how the Capitol anticipates exactly that and designs security and contingency plans so that even sabotage becomes part of the show. The weak link, where the Capitol's perfect machine starts to crack, so the Capitol has redundancies on redundancies, backup power, backup arenas, 3 different ways to kill a broadcast from a single district. On paper, that sounds unbreakable. But here's the real question. If you harden every cable and every force field, what happens when the problem isn't physical at all? Earlier, we traced those potential weak points. The factories that build mutts, the data centers that store every tribute profile, the live broadcast infrastructure that turns the games into a global event. At face value, any of those could be the Achilles heel. Blow up the transmission tower, no more show. Sabotage the DNA labs, no more wolf mutts with dead tributes' eyes. That part matters because it tells you how the Capitol thinks. Every threat is a technical threat. Every solution is a technical fix. But this is where we talk about the real failure point. The story. The games only work because the Capitol controls the narrative relationship between spectacle and fear. The promise is simple. This is necessary, this is deserved, this is entertaining. The moment the audience in the districts or the Capitol stops believing that, all the logistics in the world can't save it. You can have a perfectly calibrated arena clock, a tribute file thicker than a fashion magazine, and it still collapses if the meaning flips. Look at Rue's death. From a game-maker's perspective, it's routine. A young tribute dies, the camera lingers, the anthem plays. But the way Katniss covers her with flowers rewrites the scene in real time. Suddenly, it isn't punishment, it's martyrdom. District 11 doesn't just watch, they riot. The arena event leaks into reality, and the Capitol's carefully scripted grief segment turns into a recruitment video for rebellion. Then the berries. Technically, nothing breaks. No force field fails. No hovercraft gets hacked. 2 tributes threaten to die at the same time, and the only system that crashes is narrative logic. The games are supposed to end with one victor. When Katniss and Peter force a double win, they expose the games as negotiable, driven by public perception, not unshakable law. Why should any district fear a rulebook that can be bent by a handful of poison berries and a live audience? And in the 75th, the rebels don't destroy the arena first, they convert it. The clock arena, this masterpiece of pre-planned torment, becomes a giant extraction device. BT's wire, the lightning tree, the force field, tools the Capitol built to control tributes, get repurposed into a jailbreak that yanks Katniss straight out of the narrative. For viewers, the games don't end with a victor, they end with a glitch, a stolen Mockingjay, and a broadcast that suddenly isn't under Capitol control. Notice the pattern? The rebels never need to level every factory or blow up every control room. They just have to hijack the story layer that justifies all of it. Turn victors from glamorous survivors into traumatized prisoners. Turn arenas from punishment into proof of Capitol weakness. Once that switch flips, every new games becomes propaganda for the wrong side. And here's the pattern interrupt the Capitol never planned for. They mapped out years of arenas, mutts, and contingencies. They just never wrote the version where people stop believing the story. So what does a regime do when its greatest weapon becomes its loudest confession? In the next section, we're going to cover how Snow scrambles to rewrite the script in real time, and why every fix only makes the cracks spread faster. When the arena becomes a battlefield, the 75th games is a logistics war. So when Snow scrambles to rewrite the script in real time, where does that script actually break? It breaks in the one place he thinks is unbreakable. The arena itself. The 75th isn't just another forest or desert. It's a clock. At face value, that sounds elegant, almost artistic. 12 neat wedges, 12 horrors on a schedule you could set your watch to. But here's the real question. Why would the Capitol build something that precise, that patterned, in a world where unpredictability is their favorite weapon? The answer is logistics. You only get hourly poison fog, timed blood rain, and rotating beast zones if you've buried a perfect ring of machinery under that sand years earlier. This is where we talk about the arena as a power plant. Those spinning sections, the force field dome, the lightning tree at midnight. That's not just spectacle. That's an electrical grid masquerading as a beach resort. There is a lot to uncover here. Every tick of that clock means valves opening, charges rerouting, mutts deploying on cue. It's a triumph of Capitol engineering because it turns nature into a programmable script. Tributes aren't just fighting one another. They're fighting an entire hidden infrastructure. But the rebels? They're not impressed. They're reading schematics. Plutarch can't improvise that lightning strike escape in the 5 minutes between Katniss spotting the tree and Beatty wrapping the wire. He has to know where the main power spine runs, how the force field is layered, and exactly what happens when a massive surge hits the right panel. That part matters because it means rebel planning started years before these games were even announced. Somebody studied old arenas as tourist attractions. Someone mapped how force fields distort arrows. Someone figured out that one tree is basically the arena's exposed nerve. So you get this bizarre logistical arms race, both sides using the same skeleton. The Capitol builds force fields, The rebels learn to hack them with BT's wire and Katniss's arrow. The capital controls hovercraft routes. The rebels infiltrate one, sync their extraction to the second, the dome shorts out, and slip into a gap that was supposed to be sealed. Same tech, same corridors, completely different story. And notice the relationship here. The more advanced the games become, the more vulnerable they are once someone else touches the controls. When Katniss shoots that arrow into the sky, she's not just breaking glass. She's turning the entire logistical backbone of the games against its owner. Cameras fry. Weather fails. The arena, this monument to order, literally falls out of the sky. So what does that tell us about power in Panem? It says the capital's authority isn't magic. It's a network. And any network can be rerouted. The promise of the games was that the capital alone could decide who lives, who dies, and which district gets hope for another year. The 75th proves that once someone else can edit that decision in real time, the whole performance stops being a warning and starts becoming an invitation. An invitation to what exactly? In the next part, we're going to cover how that stolen infrastructure turns into open war and why every arena the capital ever built quietly becomes a battlefield waiting for a signal. Illusion of freedom, how long-term planning hides the cage, and that invitation is the final twist, because on screen, the Hunger Games look spontaneous. A name pulled. A girl volunteering. A fire dress that no one saw coming. But here's the real question. How much of that was ever actually up to chance, and how much was the end result of a planning cycle that started before those tributes were even born? At face value, each arena feels like a one-off nightmare. Jungle, desert, frozen wasteland. In reality, we're looking at a rotating catalogue of death environments prototyped and wired years in advance. The 75th's clock arena. That part matters because you don't bury that much tech in the ground on a whim. You build it, test it, mothball it, then wait for the year the story needs a ticking clock spectacle about time running out. And that's the pattern across every layer we've talked about. Tribute files aren't quick notes, they're lifelong dossiers. Surveillance footage from the seam, aptitude scores from school, medical records, even how you react when a peacekeeper raises their voice. Careers in the richer districts grow up inside a pipeline that feels voluntary, a prestigious training academy. But the outcome is the same, a curated supply of photogenic killers ready to fill a narrative slot. This is where we talk about the illusion of opportunity. Every system the capital builds around the games is sold as a door you might walk through. Mutts, supposedly a last-minute horror the Gamemakers unleash when things get boring. In practice, they're the polished end product of a decade-long R&D program, complete with DNA archives and psychological profiling. Sponsor gifts, marketed as pure, democratic generosity from the audience. In reality, they're routed through pre-approved channels, priced to manipulate pacing, and used to reward tributes who hit the emotional beats the script already expects. Even Victor's Village, which we've already unpacked, is part of this same architecture. It's framed as a promise: survive the arena, and you never worry about Tesserae or the reaping again. Your district gets food, celebrations, a hero to worship. But the relationship is reversed. The village is a stage set, a permanent reminder that the capital can pick one person up and leave everyone else in the mud. You're not seeing freedom. You're seeing captivity with better furniture. Psychologically, that changes how the districts read the games. If it's a pure execution, you fear it. If it's a lottery you might win, you start to plan around it. Parents debate training. Children fantasize about scores. Mayors coordinate feasts for a potential victor. The question quietly shifts from why do we tolerate this system to how do we beat it just once. That is Snow's carefully controlled hope in action. Because the logistics aren't just there to make killing efficient. They're there to hide the cage, to make it feel as though every tribute, every victor, every district is constantly making choices, when really they're walking along paths laid down years before. And yet, even inside that maze, people still find ways to turn left when the map says right. So if the capital can plan cruelty on a 20-year timeline, what does it mean that a single berry, a single salute, or a single hacked arena can still throw the script off? In the next section, we're going to cover how those tiny, impossible glitches in the system scale up into open defiance, and why long-term planning cuts both ways once the cage starts to crack. Pattern interrupt. Imagining the games 20 years before Katniss and 20 years after, so let's zoom out in a way the trilogy never really lets you. Not 1 year. Not 1 games. 20. Picture the capital 20 years before Katniss ever raises 3 fingers in District 12, the 74th arena. It's not a surprise brainstorm in some creative meeting. It's already on a hollow screen, a rotating model of forests, lakes, hidden infrastructures, and buried wiring for those sudden firestorms. The clock arena for the 75th, that part matters, because a design that intricate needs a decade of quiet testing, maintenance crews, and engineers who know that every jungle vine is sitting on top of a weapons grid. Now jump to the labs. Mutts aren't last-minute monsters. They're a product line. You've got early prototypes of wolf mutts pacing in containment cells, bird mutts rehearsing mimicry patterns, and geneticists arguing over whether human eye color on a lizard body reads as too much for family viewing. At face value, they're just tools. But here's the real question. Why invest 20 years of research into a dog that can track a tribute's fear response from half a mile away? Because the games are a long-term promise to the capital audience that the horror will always escalate. Meanwhile, out in the districts, the tribute pipeline is already flowing. Career academies in 1 and 2 are running children through obstacle courses, while in places like 11 and 12, peacekeepers quietly flag the angry, the athletic, the unusually charismatic. A 12-year-old who throws a punch at a peacekeeper. File started. A kid who sings too well at a harvest festival. Note the name for potential narrative value. Every future tribute walks around with a secret dossier, and there is a lot to uncover here about the relationship between surveillance and spectacle. Hard cut. Now go 20 years after the rebellion. You've overthrown Snow. The arenas are shut down. The games are gone. So why are there still mountain ranges full of hidden cameras and force fields humming under the soil? This is where we talk about the cost of dismantling a system that was never meant to be turned off. You can't just flip a switch on a jungle engineered to flood on command. You need demolition crews, decontamination teams, and new governments deciding whether to destroy these sites or turn them into memorials, museums, or training grounds. And what happens to the people who built it all? Former Gamemaker assistants, mutt engineers, broadcast technicians who could run a live execution feed in their sleep. Do you retrain them to design irrigation systems for District 11? Ask them to repurpose sponsor delivery drones for medical drops in District 8? The skill set is the same. The purpose is different. But how many of them can really pivot from manufacturing fear to manufacturing hope? Here's the real question. Even when the political will exists, how fast can you unwind a machine that's been optimized for death for 75 years? Some arenas will be too dangerous to touch. Some labs too tempting to keep just in case. Some staff too valuable to fully let go. The games cast a shadow forward and backward. They were never just the story that ends with Mockingjay. In the next section, we're going to cover how those shadows linger in culture, memory, and everyday life, and why ending the games on paper is very different from ending them in people's heads. From cornucopia to credits, what we've learned about capital logistics. So when you zoom out from all those shadows, what are we actually looking at? Not just a brutal TV event once a year, but an entire civilization wired around keeping the Hunger Games on life support every hour of every day. At face value, you think of the arena as a one-time stage. It's built, it's used, it's retired into a tourist trap. But here's the real question. What kind of government builds permanent murder ecosystems decades in advance? We've seen how arenas are prototyped, tested, and then mothballed, how the infrastructure for tidal waves and firestorms has to be buried years before a single tribute rides that glass tube. That part matters because it means the 74th games were being engineered before Katniss could walk, and that same jungle or desert could easily have been reassigned to a different year if the narrative demanded it. Then there's the tribute pipeline. Every child in every district doesn't just exist, they're catalogued. Surveillance, school records, tesserae counts, family medical histories. Each kid grows up inside an invisible file. Careers get the most obvious pre-games conditioning, but the capital's real power is that quiet data trail on everyone else. When you step onto that reaping stage, you're not a surprise, you're a profile finally being pulled off the shelf. This is where we talk about supply chains, because mutts don't crawl out of nowhere, and sponsor gifts don't teleport. There is a lot to uncover here. Those wolf mutts with the tribute's eyes, they hint at DNA archives, psychological notes, and an R&D pipeline that's been running in the background for years. Every silver parachute is proof of a hidden logistics network, factories, storage, routing, and timing, all tuned so a single loaf of bread can fall at the exact second it will break or preserve a victor's hope. On top of that, the games are scripted, not in the sense that outcomes are always fixed, but in the way a prestige show has multiple season outlines. Interview beats, tragic backstories, carefully framed camera angles. Those are planned arcs, with spontaneous moments waiting in the wings. And behind the spectacle, security protocols sit ready. Force fields, kill switches, hovercraft extractions, backup arenas, 3 different ways to cut the feed if rebellion breaks through. So the central claim isn't just theory anymore. The Hunger Games are not an annual event. They're a continuous, multi-year logistical operation that shapes every relationship in Panem, from where you live, to what you fear, to what you secretly hope for. And that's the final twist. All this planning, all this engineering, exists to maintain a precise emotional ratio, enough fear to prevent uprising, just enough hope to keep you participating. Until that ratio fails, in the next section, we're going to cover how, once the machinery is exposed, that same infrastructure that kept the games running becomes the thing that helps tear the capital apart. Your turn in the control room, inviting you into the victor's village of overthinkers. So if all that machinery can be turned against the capital, here's the real question. What would you target first if you were in the control room? You've seen how every arena, every mutt, every sponsor gift depends on layers of hidden systems. So I want you to step into that role for a second. Drop your own logistics headcanons in the comments. Is there an unused arena sitting in the mountains, half-finished and mothballed? A secret mutt lab under a harmless-looking capital spa? Or a single, boring-sounding department that if it went dark for 12 hours would send the games into complete freefall? This is where we talk about weak links. Earlier, we walked through how the tribute pipeline, the arena tech, the media narrative, and security are all braided together. So here's my question to you. Could the games actually survive losing one entire layer? If the force field engineers in District 3 vanished, do the arenas just become glorified forests again? If the propaganda writers in the capital went on strike, does the spectacle still work, or do the districts finally see the deaths at face value? And which district's role do you think is the most critical in that relationship? Is it District 3 with the tech, District 4 with the naval control that moves supplies, District 6 with transport, or even 2 with peacekeeper training and weapons? There is a lot to uncover here, because every minor function we've mentioned has a reason it exists, and I'm willing to bet you've noticed details I haven't even touched yet. If you're still here, You're probably not watching the games for the love triangle. You're the person who pauses to look at the control room screens, who wonders who cleans the blood off a tourist arena 10 years later. That part matters, because it means you already belong in this channel's version of Victor's Village. The people who obsess over background tech, quiet policy changes, and how a promise of hope gets manufactured on a spreadsheet before it ever reaches a reaping bowl. So if you want to keep funding these deep dives into Pan Am's systems, this is where we're going to cover more than just the arenas. Think of a subscription as sending sponsor gifts to future videos, breakdowns of how reapings are scheduled and rigged, how peacekeepers are rotated to prevent district relationships, even how capital fashion functions as wearable propaganda instead of random excess. A share is basically slipping a rebellion leaflet into someone's capital broadcast. And we're not done with the games' infrastructure yet. In a future video, we're going to cover what a post-rebellion government would realistically have to do to dismantle all of this. The tourist arenas, the MUT labs, the surveillance grids, the Victor housing. Do you scrap it, repurpose it, or risk letting it sit there, waiting for the wrong person to reactivate it? Because once you've built a system this powerful, the real danger isn't just using it. It's who gets to inherit it next. Final shot. The arena was never random. And that's the scariest part, so when you pull back from the blueprints, you end up right where we started, with an arena that existed before Katniss could even walk. At face value, that's just a creepy detail. A trivia fact about capital overkill. But now you know what that really means. It means that while she was learning to hunt in the seam, there was already a sealed dome outside the capital, wired with force fields, MUT deployment tunnels, and hidden cameras, just waiting for a year that fit its narrative arc. That part matters because it reframes what the games are. Not a chaotic bloodbath, a scheduled product. The 74th arena could easily have been swapped with another one sitting in storage. The MUTs weren't whipped up overnight. They were the endpoint of a research pipeline that started with DNA samples from every district and psychological profiles thick enough to use as doorstops. You don't get dog MUTs with Glimmer's eyes without filing, testing, and cataloging for years. So here's the real question. What makes this system monstrous? Is it the violence you see on screen? Or the calm, bureaucratic efficiency underneath it? The committee meetings about rainfall patterns, the budget approvals for new force field segments, the intern whose entire job is tracking which tribute's death will trend best in the capital feed. There is a lot to uncover here, and none of it is accidental. This is where we talk about scale. Systems this big survive because people assume they're too complex to touch. You're a kid in District 11. You don't argue with the weather grid that can summon a drought. You're a prep team member in the capital. You don't question why every tribute's medical record is accessible on a tablet. The games work because everyone tells themselves the same story. Someone else is in charge. Someone else is responsible, and the machine is too big to stop anyway. But then the unscripted moments slip in. Rue's song wasn't on any production schedule. There was no memo about a cross-district lullaby protocol. Yet that tiny human decision created a relationship between District 11 and a girl from 12 that the capital couldn't fully edit out. A handful of berries was never in the sponsor pitch deck, but it forced the Gamemakers to choose between their victor narrative and their monopoly on death. Even the rigged quarter quell, designed to reassert control, accidentally gathered an entire generation of victors into one arena, where they could share information and turn the clock itself into a weapon. So, in a world where the arena is always being built, where some future dome is already under construction while you're watching this, what does real rebellion look like? Is it blowing up the force field? Is it corrupting the data, jamming the cameras, refusing the script so completely that the games stop functioning as games at all? Or is it something quieter? Thousands of tiny refusals inside the bureaucracy that keep the next arena from ever opening its doors. Because if the horror is that the arena was never random, then the hope is this. Neither is resistance.